Welcome to The Explainer. So, what actually happens when a whole country can't pay its bills? The official term is sovereign default. And believe me, the reality is way more complicated and a lot more personal than you might think. First things first, let's just bust a huge myth right now. When a person or a company goes bankrupt, there's a whole legal process, right? Courts get involved, assets get sold off. But for a country, it's not like that at all. There's no global bankruptcy court that can swoop in and seize national monuments. The country itself doesn't just vanish. So what's the thing that actually breaks? It all comes down to one word: trust. So to really get a handle on this, we're going to break it down into 5 parts. We'll start with what a default really means. Then we'll look at the pressures that push a country to the edge. After that, we'll see how it all comes crashing down on everyday people. We'll look at the tough road to recovery. And finally, we'll ask the big question: can this happen to rich countries too? All right, let's get right to the heart of it. If a country isn't legally bankrupt in the way we usually think about it, what's actually going on when it defaults? At its most basic level, a sovereign default is just when a government can't, or sometimes won't, make a debt payment on time. It could be an interest payment. It could be the main loan amount. But the second that payment is missed, that's it. The country is officially in default. Exactly. I mean, people are still going to work, government offices are still open, but what really collapses is the world's faith in that country's ability to keep its financial promises. And you got to understand, that trust is like the bedrock for, well, everything. It's the foundation for international trade, for investment. When that's gone, it's like the country's financial oxygen gets completely cut off. So how does a country even get to this point? I mean, it doesn't just happen overnight, right? A default is almost never caused by one single thing. It's usually a whole pileup of different pressures that just becomes too much to bear. Yeah, and these pressures come from all over. You've got stuff happening inside the country, like taking on way too much debt or just political chaos. And then you have these huge curveballs from the outside world: a global pandemic, a sudden war, or maybe the price of your main export, like oil, just totally crashes. A lot of the time, it's a dangerous mix of all of these hitting at once. And this analogy right here, it's perfect. Healthy debt is fine. It's like a mortgage you can actually afford. But unhealthy debt? That's when a country gets stuck in this awful loop where it's borrowing new money just to pay off the old money it borrowed. Sooner or later, someone's going to stop offering you new credit cards, and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. And this right here is a huge, huge problem, especially for developing countries. Think about it. They collect taxes and earn money in their own local currency, but a lot of the time, they have to borrow money in US dollars. So what happens if their own currency suddenly gets weaker? Well, the size of that dollar-denominated debt just explodes overnight. And this can happen even if they haven't borrowed a single extra dollar. It is a really vicious trap. Okay, so we've talked about the high-level finance stuff, but this is where it gets real. A default might sound like some technical thing on the news, but for the people actually living there, it sets off this incredibly painful chain reaction. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is about daily life completely falling apart. And this is how it all goes down, just like a row of dominoes. It all starts with the investors. The second a default is announced, or even just rumored, they panic. They start selling off the country's bonds and pulling their money out as fast as they possibly can. And this massive wave of selling just causes the local currency to absolutely plummet in value. Now, with a crashed currency, everything the country needs to buy from the outside world becomes insanely expensive. And we're talking about the absolute essentials: fuel to run cars and power plants, life-saving medicines, even basic food items. This leads straight to massive inflation, where your money is worth less and less every day, and shortages, where you go to the store and the shelves are just empty. And this is where the crisis really truly hits home, right in people's daily lives. People get scared the banks will collapse, so they rush to pull out their savings, which of course puts the banks under even more stress. The government might even have to limit how much money you can take out. Credit just evaporates, businesses can't get loans to operate, and they start letting people go. The whole economy shrinks, and it causes just widespread, devastating hardship. So things are bad, really bad. How does a country even begin to climb out of a hole this steep? Well, the path back is long, it's painful, and it all comes down to rebuilding that trust that was completely shattered. The first big step is almost always what's called debt restructuring. Think of it like a really, really tense renegotiation with everyone you owe money to. The goal is to come up with new terms, Maybe you get more time to pay, maybe a lower interest rate, or sometimes even partial debt forgiveness, which, in financial slang, is called a haircut. But yeah, trying to get a new loan? Good luck with that. After a default, the country's reputation is just in tatters. This analogy pretty much sums it up perfectly, right? Lenders are incredibly wary because the country has proven it can't or won't pay its debts. It can take years, even decades, to rebuild that kind of credibility. This is usually when organizations like the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, step in. They can provide these huge emergency loans to try and stabilize the economy. But, and this is a huge but, that help comes with some very strict conditions, often called austerity measures. Now, on one hand, supporters say these are tough but necessary medicine to fix what's broken. But on the other hand, critics argue it's basically poison, forcing painful cuts to things like healthcare and education that hurt the poorest people the most. It often feels like a total loss of control over your own country. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds like a problem for developing nations. And for the most part, it is. But that brings up a really important question. Can wealthy, developed countries default too? Well, the short answer is yes, but the risk looks totally different. For a rich country that borrows in its own currency, like the US with the dollar or Japan with the yen, they can technically always just print more money to pay their debts. So for them, the risk isn't really that they can't pay. It's more about their credibility and the risk of runaway inflation. The biggest danger is often political, a scenario where they won't pay, because political fighting gets in the way. And we've actually seen this play out in the United States. A couple of times, the country has gotten dangerously close to a default, not because it was out of money, but because of intense political battles over raising its legal borrowing limit, what's known as the debt ceiling. Just the threat of a default was enough for credit rating agencies to downgrade the U.S. credit rating, which seriously damaged its financial reputation on the world stage. So, if there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's this. A sovereign default isn't just some abstract financial problem. It is a fundamental collapse of trust that spirals down into a very real crisis of jobs, savings, and the basic standard of living for millions and millions of ordinary people. And all of this leaves us with some really big, tough questions for the future. With global debt levels rising, could we see a wave of defaults that triggers a whole new global crisis? How do we find the right balance between financial reform and the very real human cost of austerity? And are there better ways to help countries build up their strength so they don't reach that breaking point in the first place? These are the things experts are grappling with right now. Hopefully this gives you a much clearer picture the next time you see those headlines about a country's debt crisis. Thanks so much for joining us.